Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. Today, we are pleased to be hosting a panel discussion on the resiliency of global supply chains. This panel discussion will feature experts within the supply chain industry who will identify the most critical areas in the supply chain to improve resiliency, discuss ways that ports can become more efficient in the aftermath of COVID-19, and delve into ways that leaders in industry, government, and education can collaborate to ensure a competitive and adaptive supply chain workforce. This panel will be moderated by Tyler Reeb, Director of Research and Workforce Development at the Center for International Trade and Transportation at the California State University of Long Beach, and editor of Empowering the New Mobility Workforce, Educating, Training, and Inspiring Future Transportation Professionals. He will be joined by our three distinguished panelists: Rick Blaskin, President of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals; Kristen Dekas, CEO and Director of the Port of Hueneme; and Ian Rourke, Vice President of Workforce Development and Strategic Partnerships at Pima Community College. As a reminder to everyone who's on the line, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So feel free to enter questions in the question box on the side of your screen at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible after the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to our moderator, Tyler.
Thank you, Romik, and thank you to the ENO team for putting out this great trio of webinars to showcase the insights of the experts who contributed to this book right here, Empowering the New Mobility Workforce. As you can see on the cover, the spirit of the book thinks about the children on tricycles today that are racing headlong into an Internet of Things future. When I convened this, veritable dream team of transportation and trade experts to contribute to discrete chapters addressing targeted workforce development problems, it was clear then that the supply chain and logistics sector was rapidly changing due to data usage, new tools, socioeconomic and global political shifts, a whole range of things. One of the big eurekas for the book overall for me was the insight that across all subsectors of transportation, there is a critical need to develop a more robust, comprehensive notion of transportation resilience. So what does that mean? That means you want to have transportation systems and workforces that are able to respond to current challenges and new unforeseen challenges. So of course, then we face COVID-19, one of the biggest challenges, quite frankly, for humanity to ever face. And that just further doubled down on the conclusion from the book that we need more resilient mobility systems. The other big takeaway from the book was, and this is also just based upon my broader examination of transportation, is that again and again, research is demonstrating that people who do not have access to mobility systems that help them get where they need to go or help them get access to the goods that they need for themselves, their families, and their communities, if those are lacking, if that kind of mobility access is lacking, then very likely that individual is dealing with poverty conditions. So beyond all that we've learned in terms of how essential our supply chains are for the livelihood of our communities during this global pandemic, it's also very clear that our path forward as a country and a democracy is to promote social mobility, and literal mobility systems are a critical piece of that. So in a lot of respects, what we're talking about very much has a higher calling aspect. In the near term, getting critical essential goods to families and communities, and in the longer term, creating pathways to opportunity. So I'll stop there. I really like to just get into some candid, take off the white gloves kind of conversations with our expert panelists. What I'd like to do is begin with Rick Blaskin, the president of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. And I'd like to then go to Kristen Dekas, who's the CEO and director of Port Hueneme, to address related supply chain challenges. And then we'll go to Ian Rourke, who leads workforce development initiatives for Pima Community College, to look at some of the issues we raise in supply chain discussions and how do we target those needs from an education and training standpoint. So Rick, to kick things off, when COVID hit, we as a country and as a global community, suddenly I think saw immediate impacts on our supply chain shocks. What were your big takeaways from that and how the industry responded?
Well, thanks, Tyler, and thanks for all the good work that you're doing in this area. It's important and critical. So there were a lot of things that happened early on. You'll recall that there was concern about whether the food supply chain was going to hold up. And of course, we saw that things like toilet paper and other things immediately were hoarded and so on. And then we had a shutdown, right? And sometimes we have to go back and reconsider what actually happened when we shut down schools. And I don't know, 20, 25 million people, however many people travel weekly, were no longer traveling. And so they were going to food stores to buy groceries. And of course, things like toilet paper and paper goods that they may have otherwise not bought, which are a different ply, as an example, made on different manufacturing machines than what they normally would have utilized in a restaurant, hotel, or for kids in school. So we had a huge shift in demand that was so unanticipated. And that's what caused a lot of the near-term issues until manufacturers were replenished and so on. So that's one thing that came out of this that was just right out of the blue, that type of major shift immediately in demand and what types of products people were using. And then of course we had e-commerce. How many people never used e-commerce before, and now they were home and had to use it as a major delivery system for them. So the elevation of e-commerce and the inventory from which that was shipped was changed dramatically. And now will that stay that level? Probably. We'll see a shift and increase in the number of people that will use e-commerce on an ongoing basis. Would have happened probably naturally, but now it will escalate. And so companies end up shifting their strategies on not only being resilient with their modes of transportation, but also inventory strategies. One pile of inventory for all, or do you have different piles of inventory by class of trade, or by the design of how your supply chain is getting to your consumers ultimately. So that rise in the different types of shift was dramatic. And I think overall our supply chains held up pretty well. Although you did have outbreaks, for example, I think in Iowa, there was a pork producing plant that went down for 2 weeks that supplied 4% of the nation's pork. So, what a shock, right, to the system. That's unforecasted, it's unanticipated, and just sort of happened. And now we rush to get back in stock to ensure we replenish our shelves and minimize the amount of negative impact to our consumers and to our society, as you mentioned as well. So there's lots of examples like that we will go back and look at and determine, were we resilient enough? And the answer is, well, you can always be more resilient, but some of the things that were unprecedented in what supply chain folks and transportation folks had to deal with quickly was we just never had that type of experience before. Hurricanes and weather-related geographically based events, they're anticipated. I think this was something that was not. And then regarding our workforce, you and I have had many discussions on workforce mobility and how do we get our workforce to where it needs to be. Even before 7-8 months ago, I remember being on webinars like this where there were so many positions available, not only in warehousing and transportation, but across the supply chain, manufacturing and elsewhere. Hopefully those jobs will come back, but we are also pretty good at looking at automation and different types of tools where we don't have people to be able to utilize those systems a little bit more broadly. So I think that our ability to understand where our inventory is served us well. I know my early days in the food industry, we didn't have immediate, accurate information on where our inventory is. Now, for the most part, we do. And data visibility tools are important to the supply chain discipline, and it's important to those who make those decisions to get ourselves back in stock, back going, replenishing the shelves and getting our consumers and our society back in where it needs to be as rapidly as we possibly can. So
Rick,
I'll stop there, but please go ahead.
Yeah, question. So what I'm hearing from you is a need for supply chain professionals to be more nimble, to benefit from real-time, if possible, situational awareness to pivot where you need to pivot. If you were to look to the future and tell the best and the brightest coming into this field, here's your toolbox that I would recommend. These are the skills I would recommend you get to thrive and to bring that resilience. Do you have a top three? You mentioned data visibility, and I certainly see that one.
I think scenario planning will help. All too often, we're just trying to get the freight out the door, get the trucks going, but planning some scenarios that you just are off the wall might help us think about what we would do if we had to reposition inventory or reposition our equipment or do something, lost a key supplier, those types of things. That's kind of normal in risk management and risk mitigation, but I think scenario planning will probably help serve that. And maybe there's a group that's what their main focus is, as opposed to those of us who are constantly operational, getting things out of the door each and every day. So I think that's important. I also think that working across functions and understanding what other functions do and have to go through during times like this is important to understand. How does somebody who is managing a distribution network really understand what procurement people are going through if they have a shortage on a particular raw material, ingredient, or packaging supply, or if manufacturing all of a sudden is going through what they're going through right now, where the ancillary items aren't getting made. You're focusing on the quote A items, the fast movers, because you're making them 24 hours, 7 days a week, and getting behind even doing that. So I think those are a few things that I'd look for us to do better in the future.
Thank you, Rick. I really appreciate that.
Sure.
And I think this is perfect entree to go to Kristen Dekas, who leads Port Hueneme. Kristen, we've had a number of good conversations about workforce development as it relates to the supply chain. We've also recently talked about how leaders in the supply chain need to do what Rick was just getting at, which was understand different scenarios and how to respond. Before we get to that, I'd just like to more generally ask you, as a leader of a port and as somebody who has led port authority associations in California and nationally, what are the big takeaways for supply chain leaders who are based in ports, terminals, and so forth?
I think to echo Rick's words, the adaptability piece has been huge. We've never seen a pandemic of this nature hit us, at least in recent history, and just having the flexibility to respond to that environment has been critical. And if I may, just real quick, for those of you that aren't aware of where Port Hueneme is, we are in the great state of California, in between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and the fourth largest port that handles about 3.3 billion bananas a year, servicing 13 states and over 350,000 automobiles, which equates to about 9.5 billion in cargo, $1 billion in economic activity, and about 15,000 trade-related jobs, just to kind of give some context to some of my comments here. But the first place we really had to be adaptable was at the workforce level, right? We all got deemed essential workers. So we had to quickly ramp up our safety plans, and we all developed what's called a COOP, a continuity of operations plan, where you set up communication trees and the like. So if you have an incident on our port system or our port complex, we have a strategy to deal with the pandemic, and that's in that case. And you've got to really treat it on a case-by-case basis. We also had to get all sorts of PPE to our essential workforce and get resilient in that respect. We have a notification system, so you can have immediate real-time information get out to the workforce. That's been key. And one unique experience that we had on the operational side here in Hueneme was in the movement of our automotive sector. When the pandemic hit, we got kind of hit on both sides of the supply chain, right? So you had all these cars that were already manufactured in transit, and then you had the retail end of our businesses closed. So you have this pipeline of vehicles en route to Hueneme, 32,000 to be precise, with no place to go. So we had to be resilient, work with our community partners. Our local university was going to make parking lots available because they were closed for their students. So we really had to get resourceful. And then after that, you have the dry spell because all of our OEMs stopped making cars. So then you have, after the storm, you have this new storm of no vehicles coming in. And we usually do around 10,000 a week. And one week we had 0. So we're starting to see the industry bounce back, I mean, as things come back online. But that kind of moves me into this commercial piece of the equation. So if you look at the port ecosystem, if one port isn't doing well, I think it's not good for any port complex in the port system and the supply chain. So by way of example, San Diego has seen a hit in just a short few months of about $60.7 million. LA and Long Beach have seen declines in volumes as high as 30% through the end of last fiscal year when this started in March. And so these big dips in cargo cause ports to get resourceful and go out and poach cargo from other ports and those sorts of things, which just isn't very healthy. And then there's some lack of clarity of what's really going to happen inside the supply chain. By way of example, where are we going to make PPE now? Where are we going to make pharmaceuticals? And how will that impact trade lanes and those sorts of things? Specific to Hueneme and the car and fruit business, we actually saw a slight tick up in fruit. There is a demand. It's more inelastic to the economy. So our banana business has been quite strong along with our other fruit commodities. So that's been a stable commodity for us. But our cars, we have seen a hit about 15%. We are forecasting a slip of about 30% over next fiscal year, which is about 50% of our revenue. So being astute and kind of honing in terms of being resilient in the commercial markets, we've really got to stay close with our customers. And that's hard to do when you can't take a trip to Miami right now where your headquarters are for your big business players. So you have to get creative, get out there in the virtual world, really stay in touch and communicate and keep your customers happy. Got to make some concessions in your contracts and just really encourage the cargo to keep coming to your facility. And we've had success there, but it's scary times, you know, it's just with all this loss in business, It's scary times.
Well, that's very instructive to hear some actual examples that build on what Rick was talking about, which is how do you use forecasting tools? How do you understand scenarios so that as a port or as a stakeholder within the supply chain, whatever the case might be, you as an organization are mitigating risk, working together, doing all of the things that supply chains do so well. And in many respects, I feel like our national and global supply chains are going to be bellwethers for how the overall economy is going to need to respond. Being open-minded in how you look at infrastructure and resources, the empty parking lots at university campuses to store temporarily all these vehicles is a great example. And you look at but all of this only really makes sense if you have the wherewithal as a decision maker to know where the goods are, where the demands are, where the shortfalls are, and how to make a move. I'm curious, Kristen, when you think about hiring right now, every leader of every organization has this concern. Where are the skills gaps? Where do you think, boy, if only I could get more talented professionals skilled in X? Where are your needs right now?
Well, it's a good question, Tyler, and it's quite a tap dance right now because you have to balance the fiscal realities and financial realities that you're facing, along with the needs to provide the fundamental important services that we do to access global markets, trade, and do all the good work, frankly, too, that we've done in the environment. Stewardship, these are very expensive infrastructure programs that we run here in California. We plug our ships in, it's a big lift, but an important one. So one area where we're trying to get creative as public agencies and port authorities is really securing grant opportunities to build out infrastructure, which will put people to work and create construction jobs and engineering jobs and those sorts of things. I find in our organization that actually we will be hiring an IT manager. given the whole virtual world and not wanting to have hiccups in settings like this, and really needing to communicate widespreadly with our customer base all over the world. We really need strong technology. So that's a place where I think you're going to find some opportunities despite the financial hardships that ports are up against. And then there's just some other important jobs in terms of at the facilities level, believe it or not. They might sound simple, but they're important. The custodial work, you know, keeping the place clean and sanitized. And we're looking to hire in that respect. And those are important jobs for certain areas of the workforce as well. And then again, you know, something that's always been a priority for us, even pre-COVID, is the visibility in the supply chain and data integration and building efficiencies into systems so that you have one point of data entry that speaks to operations and billing and administration. So you're all working from the same data set, and less room for error, and optimizing efficiencies is a key area of workforce development in our port industry, along with supply chain development too, and having visibility throughout the supply chain so you can tell a customer where their cargo is and it's not going to be sitting at a port, and you have visibility. I think that will create certainty in the marketplace as well, and is an area for growth and job opportunities.
That all makes sense. So then now, further complicating it, pre-COVID-19 and post, in California certainly, and California leads typically the rest of the nation, there's a lot of environmental demands, a lot of emissions mandates coming through the pipeline. How are you balancing those demands with all of the others that have now come online?
Again, another really good question. We had an interesting moment here in California where we had all these heat waves, but yet we're being pushed towards a transition to dependence on electricity. And we're actually had a governor's order put out last week asking us to stop plugging our ships in, because every ship that plugs in provides power for 10,000 homes with cooling systems and those sorts of things. So one of the most important things is we're looking to grow environmental infrastructure to support a transition to a carbon-free economy, is really increasing our capacity in terms of electricity or exploring other alternative fuels. And that's been a priority. We're looking at hydrogen fuel cell systems. We're looking at something called a bonnet system, which is an electric system where you put a cover over a ship stack so that it's a non-polluting ship in that respect. But we're trying to get innovative and creative there. But the train hasn't stopped moving with the regulators at ARB. There's going to be a hearing this week, and they're going to be pushing and continue to push the charge towards a zero emission economy. So again, we're going to have to get resourceful, look at grant opportunities, work with our state and ways to pay for this infrastructure, and also make sure, most importantly, we have the capacity and people's electricity needs are met at the state level across the board.
That's a really interesting example of COVID you've got plug-in cold ironing technologies, and that's actually used during a time of, well, national disaster to help other parts of our economy and our society function. That really drives home the point that we have civic markets in this country, and it requires very thoughtful collaboration between leaders in industry, government, and education, research and development to work together to solve these problems that aren't fixed points in a static orbital system. These are moving, dynamic situations. So all of the skills that both you and Rick are talking about, I can see is very relevant. So speaking of skills, this is a perfect time to bring in Ian. Thank you, Kristen, for your insights. Look forward to bringing you back to the Q&A with Rick. I'd like to introduce Ian Rourke, who is the Vice President of Workforce Development at Pima Community College. He also undertakes a lot of very thoughtful strategic partnerships for Pima, which is doing outstanding work. So Ian, you heard some great feedback from Rick, Kristen, talking about the kinds of skills that current and future supply chain professionals need. When we talk about the future workforce, we're talking about emerging professionals as well as incumbent coming back. So just right off the cuff, having heard all of that, having been in the trenches as an educator, thinking about how do you pivot off of COVID-19, where are your priorities? How would you really triage things to come up with the most targeted trainings to address these COVID driven concerns?
Sure, and it was an honor to follow such esteemed guests as Rick and Kristen and Tyler. Thank you for allowing us to come and share what we've been up to at Pima Community College to address these challenges, and what many community colleges are doing to partner with their communities and their employers to address really what is paradigm altering time for our sector, especially with education and training. I think really in listening to both Rick and Kristen, it goes back to three terms that are overarching focus points for us as we expand our workforce development programs, facilities, and partnerships at Pima Community College. Under our Centers of Excellence paradigm, we look at that through three lenses of convergence, speed, and adaptability. Even prior to COVID-19 and the subsequent economic downturn, we realized that the old way of doing things in education and training wasn't working for the very same workforce supply reasons that Rick was highlighting. We came to the conclusion through our research, through data, and just talking with employers that linear approaches to supply and demand in workforce development no longer fit the reality. There was no longer a younger emerging workforce that was continually growing and coming to us right out of high school, and then in a linear fashion training for a specific job, and then working up through a very strict hierarchy or career ladder in that field. We knew that occupations, training programs, and skill sets were all blurring and blending, as were modalities. Old paradigms of credit versus non-credit were being challenged and blended by competency-based models. We already knew that just for the sake of meeting the needs of working learners, and so for example, the average age at our college is not 18 or 19 or 20. The average age at our institution, we serve about 45,000 students a year in Southern Arizona, Pima County, and metropolitan Tucson. The average age at our college is 28. Vast majority of our people are working learners. And so we realized that the times of day and the modalities that we used to deliver instruction were no longer working. We're already seeing a massive increase in gravitation to online learning. So we started pre-COVID moving to a paradigm where to help our students be adaptable and meet the challenges of this workplace with such speed and recognition of these convergence of technologies and paradigms, that what was going to be moving online, we needed to move online. And even in career technical and workforce education, whether that's automotive technology, logistics and warehousing, truck driver training, any part of that we could deliver in an online format, we would, and preserve that precious time that our working learners have to come to us for face-to-face instruction to be the highest and best use in our laboratories and our facilities that we're expanding for those things that do need a physical touch point. And we also knew that because of rapid changes in automation and the displacement of certain skill sets or entire jobs, as in the case of what's coming with autonomous vehicles, and particularly with truck driver training, we knew that we needed to develop and design training that wasn't predicated, again, on a linear pattern of I just need the certificate and then a job, and college is a one and done thing. We needed to redesign programs and have multiple offerings that allowed people to keep coming back to Pima Community College so that they could be prepared for the advent of automation. And what we've seen with COVID is that is actually increasing. The rate at which, we heard it on this panel, the rate at which employers are going to seek automated solutions to meet the workforce challenges that they currently have instead of always seeking people. We have to prepare people for that reality so that they can remain relevant. And at the end of the day, our mission is to help them have higher wages and family sustaining wages in our community. And so it's our obligation. A great example of that is we've worked with Too Simple, the autonomous truck company that is, their engineering operations and testing operations are located here in Tucson. Their headquarters is actually in San Diego. And we developed the first ever community college focused autonomous vehicle driver and operations specialist program, which helps truck drivers train for that reality of certain skill sets that require humans decreasing and other skill sets require humans increasing and preparing them for that reality. So those are just some of the things that we've been up to. And with respect to the pandemic, it has hastened our response, not changed our direction into what's going to be virtual is going to be virtual, blending working and learning through work-based learning models, and not only focusing on certificates and degrees with terminal points into the entry-level job market, but a paradigm of perpetual retraining, upskilling, and recareering individuals so that they can be more resilient in this dynamic and sometimes volatile labor market.
That's very helpful. And what that's making me think about as you're talking, Ian, is how leaders in education need to think about, take something from the commercial sector, the buyer's profiles of students. What are their mobility challenges? If you've got a population of people all around the country that are in very, very rural places where it is a struggle to get to and from work, and they're open to trucking, that's a good job. Now, one thing I know that PEMA has done is it's moved all of the written training for a commercial truck driving license online, which means in concept, populations of people far away in very rural areas who have a satellite or some kind of broadband link could take care of all of their non-in-the-cab training from home. And I think that this is very much the case, not only on the educator side, but just plain and simple on the e-commerce side. I think COVID, if nothing else, has really put into overdrive a lot of the telework, virtual education, distance learning, all of the things that maybe had a stigma or something holding it back just a little bit. That's gone now. And I think to your points that you've just nicely covered, it's incumbent on leaders in education to think about the access needs for students, working learners, as you say. I think that's all very good. To flip it now, what do we need to do to compel, to inspire our teachers to up their games in distance learning and more lean learning, focusing on priorities, things like that? A good colleague of mine has said that right now a lot of online education is still just treading water. How do we up our game so we're swimming, not treading water? What do we need to do to empower our teachers?
I'm very honored to speak on behalf of our college and our Chancellor, Lee Lambert, who recognized early on, again, even prior to this pandemic, that if we expect our instructors to function well in a virtual and online environment that's coming, we need to dedicate the resources to help make that happen. So at our college and other colleges similarly, we are investing increased amounts of our dollars strategically to ensure that we provide the training necessary, but also instructional design is crucially important. And so just recently, my peer and colleague, Michael Amick, hired 5 instructional designers that are going to be working with my team and me to prioritize and expedite the implementation of these hybrid models, specifically in career technical education and workforce programs for upskilling and retraining. That's a real commitment at a time when all of our budgets are constrained. And so it's incumbent upon those of us that are leading on the ground to not just talk the talk, but to actually put the resources and the time where it's needed. And at PEMA, we're doing that. Equally, we hear in higher education a lot about criticism toward the value of online learning. It's true that student outcomes in online learning trail or lag those in traditional face-to-face experiences. But at the end of the day, it's really not about the modality that led to that gap in student outcomes. It's really the fact that we've always viewed online learning as the exception, as the one-off, as not the main show. And then all of a sudden we have a pandemic that forces it to be the main model of instruction for the entire country, if not the entire world. And we weren't fully prepared for that level of scale so fast. So of course there's going to be that gap in student outcomes because we did not prepare ourselves for the eventuality one day that it may be the main course, the main way in which we do things. I think that reality is now set in, and we're going to see more and more educational leaders driving resources to ensuring that our faculty and our instructors and our student support services staff are successful in a virtual world, because even when the pandemic lets up and eventually someday we emerge, the working learning style, the blending of working and learning, and some of us are saying we're not working from home, we're living at work. That dynamic may not fully ever go away. And so it is incumbent upon us to ensure that our faculty, our instructors, and our staff have adequate, more than adequate resources necessary to do their jobs well, and serve our students and communities.
Yeah, well said. And I think also a realization that it's not apples to apples. You're not just going to move a brick and mortar in-class instruction and just do it online.
Right.
There's a lot of obstacles. There's going to be learning needs assessments, benchmarking the success of these courses, addressing the very real issue of screen fatigue, people being distracted by multiple electronic devices. When I would teach a class, I'd always make it clear that I wanted the mobile devices gone, or I would use them proactively enlisting everybody to take a live survey or something like that, so that you, in effect, hijack the distracting technology. All of this is going to need to change. A lot of the early pedagogical findings I'm reading are that learning modules need to be sometimes only 15 minutes and move quickly. So you're able to take advantage of engagement and then break out. How do you do group work? Group work is a challenge in a classroom. How do you create rich, engaged group work in a virtual environment? This is all, as you say, Ian, the new frontier. These were things that that I think were talked about as visionary and where we were going, where the future was, and as horrifying as this global pandemic is, one thing that it certainly has done is, I think, created a very compelling reason to up our distance learning game across the board. So this is, I think, a great point. We've got 3 really outstanding experts, subject matter experts. I'd like to bring everybody back, and I'd like to transition to the Q&A phase of this webinar and have a discussion. I'd like to hear if we've had any questions come in. I can tell you, all participants involved, this is a great group of people to pose questions to. They're dealing with this stuff every day. So back to you, Ramik.
Thank you so much, Tyler, and to all of you for a really great discussion, very timely, and there's this continuing uncertainty over when and how our current crisis will continue to evolve. So let's get into some of the questions that we've gotten from our listeners. Going back to something we talked about earlier in this discussion about supply chains and shifts to e-commerce and consumer behavior. We had a couple questions, I guess, in a 2-part question. One, to what extent do we think, or do you all believe that some of the changes that we might be seeing in consumer behavior and preferences, either towards e-commerce or other, the pace and frequency and way in which they shop are going to be permanent, and to what extent do we think, certain behaviors will revert back to their pre-COVID mean? And consequently, to what extent do you think that there will be shifts in just-in-time manufacturing services and approaches?
Well, I can give it a go here. I do think there is a remarkable shift in e-commerce or whatever we would like to call deliveries that may go to a different place versus you going to it. Does that eliminate all retail space? I doubt it. I think there is a place for people to go have a retail experience of some kind. But the ability to make it easier for consumers to get access to the products that they need and want at reasonable prices has been delivered in many respects. So I think that companies are going to continue to figure out a way to get to you. I remember when I was at Nabisco, I always thought if I could make an Oreo inside your stomach, I would save so much money on packaging and transportation and inventory. But we can't do that, but we figure out other ways. So it'd be interesting to see what the others think, but we'll see some shifts coming out of this for sure.
I think it might actually create some hybrid models for consumers to have different types of choices in the marketplace. Just to, from my line of the business, say, for example, in cars right now, whoever thought that people would really have an appetite for buying a vehicle online? But maybe because there's a pandemic and you want a car delivered right to you, you can test drive it, they'll bring it back. It creates all these new conveniences that you may have never thought of before that could be selling points for a different way of doing business. I think customers are getting, or industry is getting manufacturers are getting very creative in how they sell their products and coming up with deals, if you will. I think at one point, Hyundai Kia, as a customer of ours, was offering 2 for 1. I mean, that's unheard of in the automobile business, So I think you're going to see a lot of creative. I think you're going to see industry get really creative in trying to innovate new consumer choices and opportunities without losing old platforms.
From a workforce and economic development perspective, I agree with both it being a shift and then hybridization of it. The thing about approaching workforce development in the labor market through a supply and demand model is that the supply always has a choice. They have a choice in where they want to go educate themselves and train themselves, and they have a choice in where they want to go to work. And I think that the more traditional providers of higher education have woken up and realized that the shift has already occurred, that marketplace experience and that online market, that e-commerce experience of education and training, we are in that age now. And it is really challenging us to ensure that, as Rick said with the retail experience, that our face-to-face experience is something that is distinctive and better and adds value to the experience. It can no longer just be a run-of-the-mill traditional lecture experience anymore. It really needs to add that value.
Those are excellent points. And to build on what you're saying, Ian, it makes me think about education. I think for too long, education has been treated like a big multiple vitamin. Here you go, and then you're done. And you're going to pay for it all up front. And we're seeing more and more discussions now about evergreen degrees, pay-as-you-go degrees, this idea that, education has become so expensive. We're looking at all kinds of new hybrid models for transportation and land use. Why not have some new models for education? The idea, I think, that terms like lifelong learning make us think about, in your twilight years, you take a recreational 2 units in lawn bowling or something. Whereas I think we know now that if you're 27 and you completed your degree and you're not staying on the learning curve, you're obsolete. When we talk about transformational technologies and the rapid rate of change, not to mention all of the different socioeconomic and global issues, the only thing, not to sound trite here, but the only thing we can really expect a lot of is a lot more change. And I think on all fronts, our supply chains need to become more nimble. And as educators and trainers, we need to embrace that same, I think, enterprising and open-minded approach.
Thanks, Tyler. And on that point about adaptability and nimbleness, we've had some questions kind of back to the policy end for policymakers. What strategies and priorities should policymakers at the state level, particularly transportation agencies and DOTs, consider and adopt given the changing freight environment? And there's a lot of uncertainty. So if you could elaborate on some of your recommendations for priorities for DOTs and other policymakers.
I guess I'll kick that off. I think one of the most important discussions, whether pre-COVID, post-COVID, but again, it comes down to creating competitive USA supply chains, right? And investing in the infrastructure that supports those supply chains so that we really hold on to a competitive niche with trade partners around the world. We're getting outpaced right now. And so I think at the policy level, we really need to fine tune our strategic planning in transportation and supply chains to optimize our efficiencies and investments in infrastructures. And what a better way to create jobs as well. Also, there's just a consistency in policy discussions around important work in the environment. I could go on forever around policy discussions in ballast water and a number of different areas where we really need some continuity and direction to build a global solution that will really impact climate change, not just plugging a ship in California, but how are we going to do this globally so you really have more profound impacts to global challenges and supply chains and those sorts of things. So, but I think investment in infrastructure and consistency in policy, working together, finding solutions is key at the policy level.
I think
Rick, or Ian? Yeah.
Just real quick from a workforce perspective, and what Rick and Kristen said is that someday when, things pick back up in the economy again, they're going to need people who can get the job done at all levels of their organizations. And oftentimes, some of the constraints that the education sector faces are self-created, but others are policy issues. And at the end of the day, educators are creative, and what we need is a policy structure and an accreditation structure that allows us to be more creative with respect to implementing these new models that give us the flexibility to help get people who are highly trained to Kristen and to Rick and to their supply chains faster.
Yeah. I think there's something I noticed very early on when I started my transportation research was how fraternal, how much camaraderie there were in supply chain organizations, how much, quite honestly, how giving so many kind of senior leaders were to next generations. And I think that there just needs to be more of that, if anything. And I keep saying it, but I do feel that supply chain thinking, supply chain innovation will be a bellwether for our entire economy. We're seeing big box retail turn into fulfillment centers. We're seeing it, commercial real estate uses change. As Rick and Kristen have noted, e-commerce has doubled, if not more. And there's a need for collaboration. And we do have a unique moment in time right now. Right now, students all around the country are coming back to school staring at laptops alone. There's a lack of community. There's a bit of a vacuum. But there's also a unique moment in time for leaders in industry government education to bring unique challenges to the next generation. To say, you know what, let's find a way to have a contest that you can submit your coursework to, and a jury of subject matter experts will review it. And if you win, you get a paid online internship, and you get to put that on your resume. Hackathons, things like that, to try to imbue meaning into the sort of abstract learning environments that we're in right now. But it's a time to innovate, and I think, for my part, hearing, to begin with, the great overview from Rick and Kristen on operationally what's happening, and then from Ian with all of these very forward-thinking migrations to online, more modular education. We're hearing insights from supply chain leaders who are innovating right now, and we just need more of that. That's the X factor, I think.
Well, on that note, we are just about out of time. So again, thank you so much, Tyler, for moderating, and to all of our panelists and speakers for their insight and expertise on this incredibly timely topic. As usual, our slides and recordings will be posted on the Center for Transportation website shortly. Thank you again, and we hope to see you on another webinar in the near future. Thank you again, all.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you to the team. Have a
Thank
great
you,
day,
everybody.